My husband always insisted, "Don't go into the upstairs room, that's my office." For 8 years, I obeyed. But yesterday, he left for a business trip, and I heard a child crying from that room. When I broke the lock. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Hensley. I was 34 years old when my life split cleanly in two. The part before I broke down that door, and the part after. I need to tell you both halves, because the second one makes no sense without the first. I met Daniel Hensley at a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit in Seattle. He was tall, composed, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He wore a charcoal blazer and held a glass of sparkling water, and when I made a joke about the canapés, he laughed in a way that reached his eyes. We married 19 months later in a small ceremony in my mother's backyard in Portland. I wore my grandmother's pearls. I thought I was the luckiest woman in the room. We moved into Daniel's house in Bellingham, a Victorian on a quiet tree-lined street with tall windows and original hardwood floors. It was beautiful in the way old houses are beautiful, a little cold, a little secretive, full of creaks that sounded like whispers after midnight. I told myself I loved it. I told myself a lot of things in those early years. On our first night there, Daniel carried the last moving box upstairs and paused on the landing, his hand on a narrow door at the end of the hallway. "This is my office," he said. His voice was even, pleasant even. "I do sensitive work up here. Contracts, client files. I need to keep it locked. It's just a professional habit." He smiled. I smiled back. I said, "Of course," and I meant it. For 8 years, I meant it. He was a financial consultant with corporate clients in 3 states. The locked room made sense in the abstract, the way a lot of things made sense in the abstract with Daniel. He was private, but I had called that self-contained when we were dating. He was controlling, but I had called that organized. He kept our finances in a spreadsheet only he could edit, but I had called that efficient. I was fluent in the language of reframing by the time the real trouble started. 8 years of practice. Our life was, from the outside, lovely. We had a golden retriever named Scout, a kitchen garden in the backyard, dinner parties on the first Saturday of every month. I worked as a copy editor for a mid-sized publishing house downtown. We talked about children in the vague, someday way, and Daniel would change the subject with such smooth precision that I never noticed the subject had changed at all. The first warning sign I can trace with certainty came 14 months before I broke that lock. I found a grocery receipt in Daniel's coat pocket. I was looking for his dry cleaning ticket, nothing more. The receipt was from a Safeway 2 towns over. Applesauce, string cheese, baby wipes, children's ibuprofen. I set the receipt on the kitchen counter and stared at it. Daniel had no nieces or nephews nearby. His mother had passed 6 years ago. There was no baby shower in anyone's calendar, no pregnant friend I could name. When Daniel came home, I held up the receipt and asked lightly who he'd been shopping for. He glanced at it. "One of my clients has a new baby," he said. "Dropped off some things as a gesture. You know how it is." He kissed me on the cheek and moved to the refrigerator. I put the receipt in my coat pocket. I told myself I believed him. 3 months later, I walked past Scout in the hallway upstairs, and the dog was sitting perfectly still outside that locked door, ears forward, nose working, the way he sat outside the back door when a squirrel was in the garden. I called Scout's name. He didn't come. He stayed there, pressed against the gap at the bottom of the door, tail flat. I stood at the end of the hallway and watched him. Animals don't lie, I thought. It was the first honest thought I'd allowed myself in months. Then Daniel's business trip was announced 2 weeks later. 5 days in Chicago, a client merger, early flights. He kissed me goodbye at 6 in the morning, rolled his suitcase down the front steps, and drove away in the gray November light. I stood in the kitchen with my coffee and watched the taillights disappear, and I told myself this was an ordinary Tuesday. I made toast. I answered 3 work emails. I walked Scout around the block. It was 11:15 in the morning when I heard it. I was coming up the stairs to change out of my running clothes, and from behind that narrow door at the end of the hallway, Daniel's office, Daniel's sacred professional space, came a sound that stopped every thought I had ever had. A child crying. Not a television, not a podcast. Not the neighbors through the wall. The wall faced east, toward open yard. This was inside the house, inside that room. A small, exhausted, real human cry, the kind that had been going on long enough that whoever was making it had run out of energy for screaming and was simply weeping with the quiet persistence of someone who no longer expected anyone to come. I stood on the top stair and gripped the banister, and my coffee cup rattled against the wood. My heart was slamming. My vision had gone strange at the edges. There is a child in that room. I didn't move for 60 seconds. I counted. Then I walked to the door and I put my hand flat against it, and I said quietly, "Hello? Is someone there?" The crying stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. I stood with my palm against that door for a long time. Long enough that the wood felt warm. Long enough for my breathing to slow from panic into something closer to cold, deliberate calm. The kind that doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you've decided to be afraid later. The silence on the other side held. Whatever, whoever was in that room had heard me and gone quiet. That alone told me something. A television doesn't go quiet when you speak to it. I stepped back. I walked downstairs on careful feet. I sat at the kitchen table and set my coffee mug down and looked at my own hands, which were shaking slightly, the way hands do when the brain hasn't caught up to what the body already knows. Think, Claire. I had been married to Daniel Hensley for 8 years. I had shared a bed, a bathroom, a dinner table with this man for nearly a decade. I had folded his shirts and argued with him about thermostat settings and held his hand at his mother's funeral and told our friends at dinner parties that we were solid, that we were happy, that we were the boring couple that makes it work. I had believed that, or I had performed believing it so convincingly that I could no longer find the seam between the performance and the truth. Now I sat at my kitchen table with the sound of a child's crying still ringing in my ears, and I made myself do something I had been avoiding for years. I started counting. The grocery receipt with the baby wipes and the applesauce, 14 months ago. I still had it. I had put it in the zipper pocket of my winter coat and not taken it out. Why had I kept it? Because some part of me had already known it mattered. Scout at the door. Scout who was a pet, not a guard dog, not dramatic. A gentle, goofy golden who only went rigid and alert like that when something real was on the other side of something. The locked door itself. 8 years. 8 years. What working professional locks his home office for 8 continuous years and never once invites his wife inside? I edited manuscripts for a living. I had a sharp eye for the places a story didn't add up. I had simply, deliberately, refused to apply that eye to my own home. The sounds at night, twice, maybe 3 times in the past year. Soft thumps from above. I had attributed them to the house settling, to pipes, to the raccoon that sometimes walked the roof in October. I had been so cooperative with my own deception. The smell once on the laundry Daniel did on Thursday evenings while I was at my book club. A faint smell, sweet and milky, that I had noticed and then actively chosen not to think about. How many other receipts hadn't I found? How many other signs had I edited away? I pressed my knuckles to my mouth and breathed through my nose. Don't panic. Panic is useless. What do you actually know? What I knew. There was a living person in that room. A small person, by the sound of the cry. A person who had been quiet as soon as they heard my voice, which suggested either fear or training, or both. What I didn't know: who? How long? What Daniel had told them about me. Here is the thing about fear, the thing I understood sitting at that table. Fear only paralyzes you if you let it ask questions without letting you answer them. The moment you start answering, the moment you say, all right, what do I actually do next? Fear becomes something more useful. It becomes fuel. I did not call the police. I want to be honest about this because I know it seems like the obvious first step, but I had been a dutiful wife in a house where I had been systematically kept ignorant, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that if I called the police and they knocked on that door and Daniel answered from Chicago by phone and said something plausible, "It's a niece visiting, she's shy, don't alarm her," and there was nothing visibly illegal, I would have shown my hand for nothing. I would have warned him. And whatever was happening in that room would be cleaned up and moved before I could prove a single thing. I needed evidence first. Real evidence. The kind that didn't evaporate when Daniel's charm entered the room. So I sat at the kitchen table and I made a plan. It was a simple plan, and it was the right plan. Step 1. I needed to see inside that room. I didn't have a key. Daniel kept his key ring on his person at all times, something I had noted and explained away over the years as a security habit. But the door was old. The lock was a standard interior residential lock, the kind that could be turned from the outside with a flathead screwdriver in the emergency slot, or, if the slot had been replaced, with the right tool and enough nerve. I had a toolkit in the basement. I had nerve in a quantity I was only just discovering. Step 2. I needed to document whatever I found before I reacted. My phone, photos, video, timestamps. Before I touched anything, before I spoke to anyone, before Daniel landed in Chicago and checked his messages and perhaps had some way of knowing, I needed a record that was mine. Step 3. Depending on what I found, I would call someone, but the right someone, not a patrol officer who would log a welfare check, a detective, or a lawyer, or both. I went to the basement and found my toolkit. I picked out a flathead and a small tension wrench I'd used years ago for a cabinet lock. My hands had stopped shaking. I climbed the stairs. I stood in front of that narrow door at the end of the hallway, the one I had walked past 10,000 times, and I said quietly, to whoever was on the other side, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to understand." Then I got to work on the lock. The lock gave in 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the time on my phone, counting in a kind of mechanical steadiness that kept me from thinking too hard about what I was doing, which was dismantling the architecture of my marriage with a flathead screwdriver. The door swung inward. The room was dim. The curtains, heavy blackout curtains I had never chosen and never seen, were drawn against the November morning. There was a low table, a plastic bin of toys, a child's sleeping mat against the far wall with a pillow and a flannel blanket, a small lamp with a nightlight bulb, a baby monitor on the shelf, its green light blinking. And on the mat, sitting up now, watching me with enormous dark eyes, was a little girl. She was perhaps 3 years old, maybe 4, small for her age, perhaps, or perhaps exactly 3. She had dark curly hair and she was wearing a clean yellow sweatshirt and leggings, and she was clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest with both hands, and she was looking at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. Not fear, not relief. Just the exhausted, careful watchfulness of a child who has learned that adults require evaluation before trust. I did not rush toward her. I crouched in the doorway, at her level, and I held very still. "Hey," I said. My voice was soft and even. I had no idea how I managed that. "I'm Claire. What's your name?" She watched me for a long moment. "Lily," she said. Her voice was small and clear. "Lily." I nodded slowly. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" She shook her head. She held the rabbit tighter. I looked around the room without moving from my crouch. My phone was already in my hand. I started photographing. The room, the mat, the toys, the monitor, the curtain rods with their heavy blackout panels. On the small table there was a children's plate with crackers and apple slices, as if someone had left her a meal before leaving. On a shelf above the table, diapers, too small for her age, which suggested either recent transition or something else. Children's books, a plastic cup with a built-in straw, and, in a manila folder that had slipped slightly off the shelf, a sheaf of papers. I crossed the room slowly, keeping my movements visible and unthreatening. Lily watched me but didn't pull away when I passed her. I reached up and took the folder. Inside, a birth certificate. Washington State. The child's name, Lily Ann Hensley. Date of birth, placing her at 3 years and 2 months. Father's name, Daniel James Hensley. Mother's name, Rachel Noel Simmons. I read the name twice. Daniel James Hensley. My husband had a daughter, a 3-year-old daughter who had been living in a locked room in our house. I stood there for a moment with the folder in my hand, and I thought, how long? How long had she been here, in this house, while I cooked dinners downstairs and walked scout, and went to my book club, and believed in the life I thought I was living? Weeks? Months? The groceries? The baby wipes? 14 months ago. Had she been here for over a year? I photographed every page in the folder. I photographed the room again from 4 angles. I photographed the baby monitor. And then I looked at it more carefully and realized it was a 2-way model, the kind with a parent receiver. I photographed the receiver number on its base. I did not touch the monitor further. If Daniel had been using it to listen, I didn't want him to know yet that the room had been opened. I looked at Lily. "I'm going to get you some food, okay? Real food, from downstairs. And then I'm going to make a phone call. You're safe." I was not certain that was true yet, but I said it with conviction because she needed to hear it, and because saying it out loud made it feel like a promise I had to keep. Downstairs, I called 2 numbers. The first was 911. I told them I had found a young child alone in a locked room in my home, that I believed she had been confined there, and that I needed a welfare check and, if possible, a detective, rather than only a patrol response. The dispatcher was calm and efficient. She told me to stay on the line. The second call, which I made the moment I heard the sirens in the distance, was to my sister, Andrea, who was a paralegal in Seattle. "Something has happened," I said. "I need you to find me the best family law attorney in Whatcom County. Today. Don't ask me questions yet. Just do it." "Claire." "Please," I said. "Now." There was a pause. Then, "Okay, I'm on it." I hung up and stood in the kitchen, looking at the stairs, thinking about Daniel at O'Hare or wherever he was, with his phone in his pocket, and wondering when he would feel the vibration of the world beginning to shift under him. I didn't know yet about Margaret, Daniel's sister, who lived 40 minutes south in Anacortes, who had a key to our house, a key Daniel had given her for emergencies, he'd said, years ago, and who I had always found pleasant in a surface way, friendly in the careful manner of someone who is watching you. I didn't know yet that Margaret knew, that Margaret had been part of this, that Margaret was, in fact, the one who had been bringing the groceries. I would learn that soon enough. The patrol car pulled into my driveway at 11:47. I opened the front door before the officer reached the porch. Behind me, at the top of the stairs, Lily stood in her yellow sweatshirt, holding her rabbit, watching the door with that careful, measuring gaze. "She's up here," I said. "Her name is Lily. She told me herself." The next several hours moved in the way that extraordinary events do, simultaneously too fast and with a strange, granular slowness, so that I can still recall the exact grain of the wooden floor under my feet and the sound of the detective's pen clicking and the way Lily ate half a banana in 7 careful bites, while a child welfare specialist sat across the kitchen table from her and spoke in the unhurried way professionals learn when children are involved. The detective who arrived at 2 in the afternoon was a woman named Karen Okafor, mid-40s, methodical, with a habit of writing things down before she responded to anything I said. I liked her immediately and trusted her for the same reasons. She sat with me in the dining room while the specialist stayed with Lily in the kitchen, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting. The grocery receipt, Scout at the door, the baby monitor, the birth certificate. She photographed the manila folder herself, bagged it as potential evidence, and made several phone calls I was not party to. At one point, she looked up from her notepad and said, "Mrs. Hensley, do you have somewhere you can stay tonight? Outside this residence." I understood the implication. "I'm not leaving," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "That may complicate things depending on how your husband responds." "My husband," I said, "has been keeping a child in a locked room in my house. I am not leaving." She wrote something down. She nodded once. Daniel called at 4:15. I watched his name appear on my phone screen, and I let it ring twice before answering, because I needed those 2 rings to decide who I was going to be during this conversation. "Claire." His voice was careful, not angry. Careful, which told me he already knew something. Margaret. It had to be. She must have driven past, seen the patrol car, called him. "I heard there was some kind of situation at the house." "Yes," I said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "I found Lily." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which I could hear the ambient sound of an airport gate in the background and the controlled rhythm of Daniel's breathing. 4 seconds during which the carefully constructed architecture of 8 years began to audibly come apart. "I'm coming home," he said. "I imagined you would," I said. He arrived at 7 in the evening, still in his travel clothes, rolling his suitcase up the front walk with a composure that I recognized because I had married it. He had called ahead. His attorney, I later learned, was already en route. He walked into his own house, saw Detective Okafor at the dining table, saw the child welfare specialist in the living room, where Lily had been settled with a picture book and a cup of warm milk, and I watched something cross his face that was not quite shock, because Daniel did not do shock, but was the closest thing to it his features could manage. He looked at me, I looked back. "We should talk privately," he said. "There's nothing you can say to me privately that you can't say in front of Detective Okafor," I said. What followed was the first honest conversation Daniel and I had ever had, in the sense that the dishonesty finally stopped having anywhere to hide. He acknowledged Lily. He said, and I want you to understand how extraordinary this framing was, that he had been protecting her, that Rachel, Lily's mother, had been unfit, unstable, had abandoned the child and left her with him, and that he had been managing a difficult situation quietly while he figured out a legal resolution. He said this smoothly, with the particular fluency of a man who has been rehearsing the explanation in case it was ever needed. Detective Okafor wrote it down. Then Margaret arrived. She knocked on the door with 2 knocks, sharp and proprietary, the knock of someone who doesn't expect to be told no. She came in wearing a dark wool coat, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as preemptive accusation, as though she had decided in the car on the way over that whatever I had done by opening that room was the real offense that needed addressing. "Claire," she said my name in the tone of a warning. "You need to understand that this situation is far more complicated than your—" "Stop," I said. I said it quietly, and I said it once, and I said it with the full weight of everything I had figured out in the previous 8 hours. "I know you've been bringing groceries. I know you have a key. You are going to tell Detective Okafor everything, or I am going to tell her what I already know and let her ask the questions." Margaret's face changed, just slightly, just at the jaw. Her eyes went to Daniel. He said nothing. There was a great deal more. Raised voices, Daniel's attorney arriving and immediately advising him to say nothing further. Margaret's composure cracking into something harder and uglier beneath. She told me I had destroyed a carefully managed situation. She told me I had no idea what I was dealing with. She suggested, and I found this remarkable given the circumstances, that I had overreacted to finding a 3-year-old child in a locked room. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. There was a moment, standing in my own dining room while Daniel and Margaret radiated a united front of pressure and implication, when the old reflex kicked in, the one that says maybe they're right, maybe you've misunderstood, maybe this is your fault. And I felt the floor go slightly soft. But then I looked at Lily, sitting on the sofa with her rabbit and her picture book, not looking at any of us, and the floor solidified again. Margaret and Daniel left together on the advice of his attorney. Lily was placed temporarily with a certified foster family, pending the investigation. A requirement of the process that Detective Okafor explained to me carefully and kindly. I gave Lily her rabbit to keep. She held it in both hands and looked at me from the doorway of the specialist's car, and I said, "You're going to be okay, Lily." And I meant it the same way I had meant it before, as a promise that I was making to myself as much as to her. After they left, I sat in my quiet house for a long time. Then I went upstairs, into the room, and I sat on the floor and I let myself feel all of it for exactly 1 hour. The grief, the rage, the devastating absurdity of 8 years. I allowed every feeling to arrive, and I did not manage any of them. Then I got up, washed my face, and called Andrea. "Tell me about the attorney," I said. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days of sleeping more than I had in years, of long walks with Scout, of my sister coming up from Seattle to sit on my couch and not require anything from me. 3 days of not answering Daniel's calls, of watching the investigative process move forward without my active push. 3 days of letting the anger metabolize into something quieter and far more dangerous. On the 4th day, I was ready. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a letter in the mailbox. Cream-colored envelope, typed address, the name of Daniel's attorney in the return corner. Inside was a 2-page document framed as a proposal for mediated resolution. The language was careful and expensive. It acknowledged certain complexities in the marital home situation, offered a financial arrangement that was, I had to give his attorney credit, genuinely attractive in number if not in principle, and suggested that a cooperative approach would be in everyone's best interest. including Lily's. I set the letter on the kitchen table and read it twice. Then I photographed it and emailed the photographs to my attorney, a woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been recommended by Andrea and who had, in our first 40-minute call, said 3 things that made me trust her. Don't sign anything, don't meet with him alone, and let's talk about what you actually want out of this, not just what you're trying to stop. What did I want? It was the right question, and I had spent my 3 days finding the answer. I wanted Lily safe. I wanted the truth documented. I wanted out of the marriage with my financial standing intact. And I wanted Daniel held accountable. Not out of revenge, but because accountability was the only thing that protected the next person. Diane called me back within the hour. "This is a settlement trap," she said. "The language in Section 2 would require you to characterize what happened in that room as a private family matter and agree not to cooperate with any future investigation beyond what's legally compelled. They're trying to build you a gilded cage." She paused. "Don't go near it." "I wasn't going to," I said, but I was glad she confirmed it. Daniel himself came to the door that same afternoon. He did not call ahead. He stood on the porch in his good coat, the one I had always liked, and he looked genuinely tired in the way that men who have run out of strategies sometimes look. Like the performance has dropped away and what's underneath is simply exhaustion. He asked if we could talk. I spoke to him through the front door, which I did not open beyond the security chain. "Daniel," I said, "you had a child in our house, a 3-year-old, in a locked room, for at least a year, possibly longer. I don't know what conversation you think we're capable of having." "I was trying to protect her," he said again. It seemed to be the story he had decided on. From what? From a system that was going to fail her. From Rachel, who— "Stop," I said. "Whatever you say to me, say it to Detective Okafor." "Claire." His voice dropped. "We built something together. 8 years. That doesn't disappear." And there it was. The appeal to history. The reminder that I had loved him. That part of me might still find it easier to believe the story he was telling than the one the evidence told. It was sophisticated manipulation because it wasn't entirely false. I had loved him. We had built something. And the knowledge that the thing we'd built had a rotting foundation didn't fully erase the memory of what it had felt like to believe in it. I felt the pull of it. I want to be honest about that. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then I said, "Goodbye, Daniel," and I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my back against the wood. Scout came and sat on my feet, which is what he did when he sensed I needed weight. I reached down and put my hand on his head. "You always knew," I thought. You always knew something was wrong with that door. The thing that changed everything. The piece that transformed my case from suspicious circumstances to documented reality came from a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. Rachel Simmons herself. I want to explain what I had assumed about Rachel, because my assumption was exactly what Daniel had intended. He had described her as unstable, as having abandoned Lily, as an unfit mother who had essentially relinquished the child by her own chaos and dysfunction. He had said it so smoothly and with such apparent reluctant sorrow that I had, in those first days, half believed it, despite knowing I should believe nothing he said. Then Andrea found her. It took 2 days and a combination of public records and a social worker contact Andrea had through her paralegal work. Rachel Simmons was 28 years old and was living in Tacoma, where she was working as a nursing assistant at a rehabilitation center. She had been reported as a missing person by her own mother 14 months ago. The report had been closed after she was located, alive and apparently voluntary. But Rachel maintained and had maintained since the day she was found by police in a Tacoma motel room with no clear memory of how she had gotten there, that she had not left her daughter, that Lily had been taken from her. The police at the time had logged it as a domestic dispute. Daniel had spoken to them as the concerned father. Rachel had been shaking and confused and had a history, documented only because Daniel had been the one to document it to the officers, of emotional instability. The case was not pursued. I read the summary that Andrea sent me, and I sat very still for a long time. Then I called Rachel Simmons. She answered on the second ring. "My name is Claire Hensley," I said. "I think you know who my husband is. I found your daughter last week, and I need you to tell me everything." There was a silence. And then Rachel Simmons. This woman I had been taught to dismiss as an abstraction, as a cautionary tale, as Daniel's problem from before, started to cry. But not the way you cry when something is just sad. The way you cry when you have been disbelieved for over a year and someone has finally said I found her and tell me everything in the same breath. I sat down on the kitchen floor, put Scout's head in my lap, and I listened. They came on a Saturday morning, 11 days after I had broken down the door. I saw them pull up from the kitchen window, Daniel's car first, then Margaret's silver SUV behind it, parking with the particular deliberateness of people who have coordinated their arrival in advance. They were presenting a formation. I understood that immediately. I had been expecting something like this. Diane had told me that when initial pressure fails, there is typically escalation, and that the escalation tends to reveal more than the initial move. "Let them show you what they're actually capable of," she had said. "Don't react. Receive." I opened the door before they knocked. Daniel was in business casual, the clothes of a man who wanted to appear reasonable but also competent. Margaret was in the dark wool coat again, and she was carrying a folder. The folder bothered me more than Daniel's presence. It suggested she had prepared a performance. "We'd like to talk," Daniel said. "Not adversarially, as a family." Family. I let that word sit in the air without commenting on it. "Come in," I said. "The door stays open." I pulled it wide and did not step back far enough for them to feel comfortable, because I had decided that comfort was something I was no longer obligated to provide in my own home. They sat at the dining table. I sat across from them, and I put my phone face up on the table beside me, and I did not offer coffee. Margaret opened the folder. Inside were documents, printed emails, photographs, what appeared to be medical records. She laid them out with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this before. "We wanted you to have the full picture," she said. Her voice was the voice of a person performing reasonableness while feeling something else entirely. Rachel Simmons has a documented psychiatric history. These are records from a facility in Everett where she was a voluntary patient 18 months ago. A diagnosis of— "Where did you get those?" I said. Margaret paused. "Those are protected medical records," I said. "How did you obtain them?" A beat, a glance between them. "We had a right to them in the context of—" "You didn't," I said. "And your having them is a problem you've just created for yourselves." I picked up my phone and opened the Notes app, and I began typing, slowly and visibly, while I spoke. Date, time. You brought documents to my home that appear to be protected medical records. I want to remember that accurately. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Claire, we are trying to help you understand." "What are you trying to help me understand, Margaret?" She leaned forward slightly. And here is where the mask came off. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way a very controlled person drops control when they've decided the pretense is costing more than it's worth. Her voice went flat. "You have no idea what you've put in motion," she said. You called the police into a private family situation you didn't understand. You went to Rachel, who is not a reliable narrator, and she has told you a story that serves her and that you have decided to believe because it fits the version of events that justifies what you've already done. You have hurt this family. You have hurt Lily, who would have been fine. Who was fine. She was in a locked room, I said. She was safe. She was alone, I said. She was 3 years old. She was alone in a room with blackout curtains and a baby monitor, and she cried until she ran out of energy. That is not fine. Daniel spoke then, and his voice had dropped into a register I had only heard a few times in 8 years, when he was very angry, but performing very calm. The settlement offer was generous, Claire. It was designed to let everyone move forward. If you turn it down and you continue down this path, you will spend the next 2 years in litigation that will cost you more than the settlement was worth. And at the end of it, the facts of Rachel's history will be in the public record, and Daniel will be shown to have acted. Stop, I said. Are you actually trying to tell me how this will go for me? We're trying to be honest with you. You have never been honest with me, I said. Not once. Not about a single material thing. The receipts, the room, Rachel. The entirety of the last 8 years. You have not been honest. And you are not being honest now. And I think you should leave. Margaret stood. Her face had gone tight in a way that made her look older and far less pleasant. And I saw in it, clearly, finally, the structure that had supported all of this. She had not been a passive accessory. She had been a participant. She had brought the groceries. She had helped Daniel maintain the lie. She had perhaps helped construct it. You're making a mistake, she said. You don't know what we're capable of when we're not trying to protect you. I looked at her. I had been afraid of this sentence once, or would have been. A sentence like that, delivered by a person like Margaret in a tone like that, would once have activated the old machinery. The flinch, the wondering if I'd misjudged, the reflexive retreat into accommodation. Instead, I felt something settle in my chest, like a counterweight. Thank you for telling me, I said. Now please leave my house. They left. Daniel first, then Margaret, who paused in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression of genuine contempt. I held her gaze until she looked away. When the door closed, I sat down. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, but from the energy of holding a position under that kind of pressure, which takes more out of you than people realize. I breathed. Scout came and put his chin on my knee. I let the fear move through me the way you let a wave move through you if you stop fighting it. And on the other side of it was something clean and certain and solid. I was afraid. Good. Fear meant I understood the stakes. I picked up my phone and called Diane. They came, I said. Margaret had medical records. I think they were obtained improperly. I typed a note on my phone while it was happening, time-stamped. Good girl, Diane said, and then immediately, I'm sorry, that was patronizing. I'll allow it this once, I said. What do we do with that? We add it to the file, she said, and we prepare for the deposition. The family court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February, 3 months after I had stood on the top stair of my house and heard a child cry in a room I was not supposed to know about. 3 months is long enough to prepare and short enough that nothing feels abstract. The facts still have weight and heat. The people involved still carry the evidence of what they've done on their faces. Diane had built a case that she described to me with characteristic understatement as comprehensive. The birth certificate and photographs from the room, the baby monitor, which had been recovered and analyzed by the detective's office and confirmed to be active at the time of my 911 call, meaning Daniel had, in fact, been monitoring the room remotely during his business trip. The time-stamped grocery receipts going back 19 months, cross-referenced with Margaret's credit card records, which showed a regular pattern of purchases at the Safeway 2 towns over. The testimony of the child welfare specialist who had evaluated Lily. And Rachel. Rachel Simmons had spent 6 weeks working with Diane and with a victim advocacy organization in Tacoma. She had organized her account, gathered her own documentation, and found 2 witnesses, a neighbor from her previous apartment and a former co-worker, who could testify to the timeline. The last day they had seen Rachel with Lily, and the fact that Daniel had been present at her apartment on that same day. She had also, quietly, and on the advice of her own attorney, submitted to a psychological evaluation. The evaluating psychologist's report described her as a reliable and credible witness with no presenting markers of instability or delusion, a sentence that Diane framed and placed in the middle of our evidence binder. I want to tell you about the deposition, because the deposition was the first place I saw them falter. Margaret was deposed first, before the hearing. She came in with her attorney and her folder, and the bearing of a woman who had decided to be formidable. Diane asked her questions in the quiet, patient, methodical way that I had come to understand was her most lethal mode. Where had Margaret obtained the medical records she had brought to my home? Margaret said she had received them from Daniel. Who had provided Daniel with them? Margaret said she didn't know. How long had Margaret been bringing groceries to the house? Margaret said occasionally, when asked. How often was occasionally? Margaret said she couldn't remember exactly. Was it more than once? Yes. More than 5 times? A pause. Margaret said perhaps. Did she know a child was present in the house? Margaret said she was simply helping her brother manage a difficult family situation. Did she know the room was kept locked? Another pause. Did she know that the child had no contact with anyone outside the house? Margaret looked at her attorney. The pauses were what mattered. Diane had told me that. Not the answers, but the pauses, because they showed the jury where a person's certainty ran out. The hearing itself was held in a small courtroom that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Daniel sat at a table with his attorney. Rachel sat at another table with hers. I sat behind Rachel, in the gallery, with Andrea on my left and Diane beside me. Margaret was in the gallery too, 2 rows back, and I felt, rather than saw her watching me. When the judge entered, a woman in her 50s named Honorable Patricia Wren, who had, according to Diane, a reputation for precision and intolerance of procedural theater. The temperature of the room changed in the specific way that happens when authority arrives with genuine weight. The presentation of evidence took the majority of the morning. Diane presented on Claire's behalf as a supporting party to the welfare matter. Rachel's attorney presented on Rachel's behalf. Daniel's attorney made several objections, all of which were noted and most of which were overruled, each overruling adding a layer to the pressure in the room. Then Daniel was called to testify. He did, at first, exactly what I expected. He was composed. He presented Lily's presence in the locked room as an act of protection. A child placed in his care by a chaotic mother, kept safe while he navigated legal options. He described Rachel as volatile, as having surrendered custody informally. His voice was even. He looked at the judge rather than at Rachel, which was the right tactical choice and also a window into who he was. Then Rachel's attorney asked a single question. Mr. Hensley, did you at any point in the 14 months you housed Lily in a locked room file any legal documentation, any emergency custody filing, any welfare petition, any communication with Child Protective Services? To formalize the arrangement you are describing? Daniel said he had consulted with an attorney. Did you file any documentation? The attorney repeated. A pause. No, he said. Mr. Hensley, you had a child in a locked room with blackout curtains for 14 months. You employed a two-way monitoring device to observe her remotely. You traveled on business during that time, leaving her with no adult supervision visible to any public record, relying on your sister to deliver food. And you filed no documentation, is that correct? Daniel's attorney objected. The objection was overruled. Is that correct? The attorney repeated. Daniel looked, for the first time, like a man who had miscalculated how far the map extended. There were circumstances, he said. Judge Wren had been writing something throughout this exchange. She looked up now, over her glasses. Counsel, she said to Daniel's attorney, your client will answer with yes or no when the question permits it. Daniel's attorney leaned in and spoke quietly. Daniel straightened. Yes, he said. No documentation was filed. In the gallery, Margaret made a sound. Small, involuntary. The sound of a person who has realized that the thing they built was less solid than they thought. I heard it. I did not turn around. Judge Wren issued her interim ruling from the bench at the end of the hearing, which Diane had told me was unusual and significant. It meant the evidence was not close. Lily was to be returned to Rachel Simmons pending a completed home assessment, with supervised visitation for Daniel suspended until an investigation by the Department of Children, Youth, and Families was concluded. The court found probable cause for the referral of the matter to the prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges, including unlawful imprisonment and custodial interference. Daniel's attorney was still writing when the judge finished speaking. Daniel sat very still after the gavel came down, in the way that a person sits when they are internally processing a defeat they were not prepared for. His attorney spoke in his ear. He nodded. He did not look at Rachel. He did not look at me. He looked briefly at Margaret. She was already consulting her own attorney in the gallery, her face controlled with enormous visible effort. She was not doing well. I walked out of the courthouse into the February cold, with Andrea beside me and Diane one step ahead, checking her phone. The sky was the flat gray of a slate board, and the air smelled of the sound, salt and cold metal. And I stopped on the steps and just breathed. You okay? Andrea said. Yes, I said. And for once I did not have to decide whether I meant it. The legal aftermath came in stages. The DCYF investigation found that Lily had been confined without legal authorization in conditions that, while not neglectful in terms of physical provision, represented a profound deprivation of normal childhood development and contact with her mother. The report used the phrase calculated isolation. It was forwarded to the prosecutor's office alongside Detective Okafor's full case file. In April, the prosecutor filed charges against Daniel: unlawful imprisonment and custodial interference in the first degree, a felony in Washington state. His attorney attempted to negotiate. The prosecutor declined. The evidence, she said, was thorough. Margaret was charged separately as an accessory, based on the documented grocery deliveries, her key to the house, and her failure to report a child in unauthorized confinement to any authority. Her claim that she had been helping her brother manage a private family matter was not a defense. The divorce was finalized in September. Washington is a community property state. I had contributed financially throughout our marriage and had no fault of my own to defend. The house went to me. The financial accounts were divided evenly. Daniel's attorney had been hoping for leverage he never found. On the day the divorce was finalized, I drove home and sat in the driveway, looking at the Victorian's tall windows and the garden where the tulip bulbs I'd planted in October were coming up green through the soil. I had planted them after the hearing, in the deliberate spirit of someone choosing to plan for spring. I went inside. Scout met me at the door. I climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of the room at the end of the hallway. Open now, the blackout curtains long gone, full of pale winter light. I had not yet decided what to do with it. I thought about Lily, who was adjusting, who called her rabbit Mr. Ears, who was at 3 years and 6 months still at the beginning of everything. Then I went downstairs, made coffee, and went back to work. Spring came to Bellingham tentatively at first, then all at once. The tulips came up red and yellow along the front walk, and I found myself standing on the porch in the mornings with my coffee, just looking at my own garden, not managing anything, not performing careful neutrality for someone else's comfort. The ordinariness of it felt extraordinary. I had the upstairs room converted in March. Wide window, warm paint, bookshelves, a daybed. I called it the reading room. In the evenings, I would sit there with Scout at my feet and think, this is what this room was always supposed to be. My work expanded. The distance from Daniel freed up a quality of attention I hadn't known was occupied. I took on new projects, said yes without calculating the cost, and saw a therapist named Dr. Susan Park, who called what I had survived coercive control. The 1,000 small redirections that add up to a life that looks like yours, but isn't. I had dinner with Rachel in April. She brought photos of Lily. Playground, birthday cake, Mr. Ears. She calls you the lady with the dog, Rachel said. He figured it out before I did, I said. Then I couldn't have done anything else. Once I knew. Daniel pleaded guilty in June. Custodial interference, 2nd degree, still a felony. Probation, no contact with Lily. 3 clients dropped him within 2 months. His website went dark by September. Margaret pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor accessory charge and resigned from her organization 6 weeks after the story ran locally. The house is mine. The floors still creak at night, not whispers anymore, just an old structure knowing its weight. Scout is 11, slower, still the best judge of character I have ever met. Every morning he finds me and wags that slow, deliberate wag. I see you. I'm here. This is our life. He is right on all counts. Here is what I know on the other side of all of this. The locked door is almost never just a door. It is the place where we have agreed, quietly, not to look. I looked past that door for 8 years because looking felt like an accusation. And I had been taught that trust means not asking. Trust does not mean not asking. Trust is built by the asking. The discomfort you feel before you open the door is not a sign that you're wrong. It is a sign that you are on the edge of something true. What would you have done? Would you have waited another 8 years? I don't ask to judge. I ask because I know how easy the other choice is. I was that choice for a long time. I'm glad I stopped. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Share it if someone you know needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.